Okay, we are going to be reading Chasing Lincoln's Killer by James L. Swanson. I'll give you a little bit of background before I get to chapter 1. From 1861 through 1865, the United States endured a bloody civil war between northern and southern states. The conflict had begun long before over the rights to own slaves and states' rights to secede, that is, to leave the Union if they disagree with the government. In the North, where the economy was based on factories and industry, most citizens considered slavery brutal, inhumane, and immoral. In the South, where the economy was dependent on slave labor, citizens believed they should have the right to own slaves. They also believed that if the national government disagreed with that right, Southern states had the right to secede. Lincoln, elected president in the United States in 1860, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, held two strong beliefs: that slavery was morally wrong and that the North and the South must remain united as one country. Southern soldiers dressed in gray uniforms were called rebels and Confederates. Northern soldiers dressed in navy blue uniforms were referred to as Union soldiers or Yankees. The war lasted 4 years and resulted in more than 600,000 casualties, half of them lost to disease. After several bloody battles and costly, prolonged campaigns, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in the Virginia town of Appomattox Courthouse. But other rebel armies continued fighting in the field. Lee's surrender did not mean the end of the war or of danger. Some Confederate sympathizers mourned the outcome of the war. The lost cause would forever change the Southern way of life, including slavery. Many Southerners were unwilling to give up the lost cause, believing they could continue to fight and eventually win or die trying. It was a dangerous place and time. With Lee's surrender, soldiers shed their uniforms, turned in their weapons, or rode or walked home to resume their lives. Spies and Confederate sympathizers, as well as soldiers, filled the Capitol, Washington, D.C. People could not tell based on clothing, geography, or appearance which side of the conflict people supported. The Prologue. It looked like a bad day for photographers. Terrible winds and thunderstorms had swept through Washington early that morning, dissolving the dirt streets into a sticky muck of soil and garbage. The ugly gray sky of the morning of March 4th, 1865, threatened to spoil the great day. Photographer William M. Smith was to take a heroic photograph of the presidential inauguration in front of the recently completed Capitol Dome. Smith framed the view from the marble statue of George Washington on the lawn to the top of the dome, crowned by a statue of freedom. Abraham Lincoln had ordered work on the building the Capitol Dome to continue during the war as a sign that the Union would go on. Closer to the Capitol, Alexander Gardner set up his camera to photograph the inauguration. Gardner captured not only an image of the president, vice president, chief justice, and other honored guests occupying the stands, but also the anonymous faces of hundreds of spectators who crowded the east front of the Capitol. In one photograph on the balcony above the stands, a young man with a black mustache and wearing a top hat gazes down on the president. It was the famous actor John Wilkes Booth. Abraham Lincoln rose from his chair and walked toward the podium. He was now at the height of his power, which the Civil War nearly won. Clouds threatened another rainstorm, and then the strangest thing happened. The clouds parted and the sun burst out, flooding the spectacle. The president's speech was brief, just 701 words. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up our nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. On April 3rd, 1865, Richmond, Virginia, capital city of the Confederate States of America, fell to the Union forces. Now it was only a matter of time before the war would finally be over. In the Union capital, emotions were high. The rebellion was almost over, and the victorious North held a celebration. Children ran through the streets waving little paper flags that read, "We celebrate the fall of Richmond." Across the country, people built bonfires, organized parades, fired guns, shot cannons, and sang patriotic songs. 4 days later, John Wilkes Booth was drinking with a friend at a saloon on Houston Street in New York City. Booth struck the bar table with his fist and regretted the lost opportunity. What an excellent chance I had, if I wished, to kill the president on Inauguration Day. I was on the stand, as close to him nearly as I am to you. Crushed by the fall of Richmond, the former rebel capital, John Wilkes Booth left New York City on April 8th and returned to Washington. The news there was terrible for him. On April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee and the Army of the Northern Virginia surrendered to Union General Grant at Appomattox. Booth wandered the streets in despair. On April 10th, Abraham Lincoln appeared at the second-floor window of the Executive Mansion, as the White House was known then, to greet a crowd of citizens celebrating General Lee's surrender. Lincoln did not have a prepared speech. He used humor to entertain the audience. "I see that you have a band of music with you. I have always thought Dixie was one of the best tunes I'd ever heard. Our adversaries attempted to appropriate it, but I insisted yesterday we fairly capture it. I now request the band to favor me with its performance." On the night of April 11th, a torchlit parade of a few thousand people with bands and banners assembled on the semicircle driveway in front of the Executive Mansion. This time, Lincoln delivered a long speech without gloating over the Union victory. He intended to prepare the people for the long task of rebuilding the South. When someone in the crowd shouted that he couldn't see the president, Lincoln's son Tad volunteered to illuminate his father. When Lincoln dropped each page of his speech to the floor, it was Tad who scooped them up. Lincoln continued, "We meet this evening, not in sorrow, but in gladness of heart." He described recent events and gave credit to Union General Grant and his officers for the successful end to the war. He also discussed his desire that black people, especially those who had served in the Union Army, be granted the right to vote. As Lincoln spoke, one observer, Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, a free black woman, standing a few steps from the president, remarked that the lamplight made him stand out boldly in the darkness. The perfect target. What an easy matter would it be to kill the president as he stands there. He could be shot down from the crowd, she whispered, and no one would be able to tell who fired the shot. In that crowd, standing below Lincoln, was John Wilkes Booth. He turned to his companion, David Harold, and objected to the idea that blacks and former slaves should become voting citizens. In the darkness, Booth threatened to kill Lincoln. "Now, by God, I'll put him through." And as Booth left the White House grounds, he spoke to the companion and co-conspirator, Lewis Powell, that this is the last speech he will ever give. On the evening of April 3rd, Washington celebrated the end of the war with a grand illumination of the city. Public buildings and private homes glowed from candles, torches, gaslights, and fireworks. It was the most beautiful night in the history of the capital. John Wilkes Booth saw all of this, the grand illumination, the crowds delirious with joy, the insults to the fallen Confederacy and her leaders. He returned to his room at the National Hotel after midnight. He could not sleep.